Hello, everyone. Welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I'm your host, Rob, and today we're doing a roundtable discussion on Christian nationalism. We have three panelists today, and we're just going to have more of a conversation than a structured debate or anything of that manner. So I'll let each one of our panelists do a quick intro of themselves.
I'm Jerry Stutzman. I'm a ruling elder at Christ Church in Grand Rapids, and currently writing theology and cooking for my wife, and two kids, and my wife's a pediatrician. Yeah, I guess that's it.
I'm Philip Bunn. I'm now an assistant professor of political science at Covenant College. I'm married with two kids and attending a PCA church right now.
Hi, I'm Stephen Wolf. I wrote the book Case for Christian Nationalism, live in North Carolina. I was in the Army for a little while. I have four kids, married, several chickens and goats and maybe cows, but we'll see. So that's me, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, gentlemen. First and foremost, and we'll take these questions in the same way we took introduce yourselves, but our easy intro is, how do you take your coffee? And if for some reason you don't drink coffee, how do you take your caffeinated beverage of choice?
I have a morning. Yeah, every morning I grind my own, and then I do the pour over thing. I've done that for many years, and I think I'm old enough. I'm getting old enough where I'm probably going to stop doing that. I'm going to buy one of those automatic brewers. I think that was something you do in your 30s, and then you realize that it's unnecessary, and you move on to other cultural liturgies. And my liturgy is going to be pressing a button and letting it just come out without me having to do all that nonsense, because I don't care anymore. So there you go. We'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Jerry, how do you take your coffee or caffeinated beverage?
Yeah, I do. I pour over every morning, and then I supplement my caffeine with a Celsius packet in my giant mug. So
I would do a pour over, but I've been very lazy for many years. I used to use this old Goodwill Mr. Coffee maker that was just atrocious. And so then my wife, 1 year for our anniversary, gifted me a Mocha Master, which if you're switching from a pour over and you just want to push a button, it is supposed to combine the best of these things. I still grind my own beans, but it has a little basket and then heats the water and drips it over rather than the kind of standard thing. But almost always black, unless I need to chug it really fast, in which case I put milk in it so I can drink it while it's not burning.
So we heard a little bit of everyone's story going into this, but let's start with Stephen, then Philip, then Jerry, and just give us a little bit more of your background. Just like questions open-ended. What's your story? How did you come to be here? Here meaning place in life.
I guess the short version. Grew up in California, moved away when I was about 20. I went to West Point and did that 4 years, graduated 2008, was in the active duty Army for 5 years, then left. Got married in 2008, and then lived in Hawaii and all sorts of places. I was in the Army, moved a lot. And then grad school at LSU. I was at LSU for 7 or 8 years, and then had all of our four kids in that time, and then went to basically wrote about. I got a PhD in political theory, wrote about the New England Puritans and the American founding, and kind of wrote some things on that. And then, but my life project has been to try to bring together Protestantism and essentially a paleoconservative vision that was often dominated by Roman Catholics. And so that kind of culminated in my at least thinking up to my life now in the book Case for Christian Nationalism. So that came out in 2022. And yes, I don't know what else there is.
For those like myself who have heard many different definitions of paleoconservative, how do you define that word?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to define, but it generally speaking
Is it a vibe,
is
Stephen?
juxtaposed.
Is
It's a vibe.
paleoconservative more of a vibe?
It hasn't been a vibe since the early 80s, so I'm not really sure. Unless like the vibe is like Pappy Cannon holding a gun. That's probably the vibe. So we'll like type in Pappy Cannon with a rifle and he's with the cowboy hat and a gun. That's probably paleoconservative vibe. But I mean paleoconservative, yeah, it's like it's usually juxtaposed with neoconservatism. It's tends to be a emphasis on regional identity, a concern for social life and cultural preservation, conservation, a anti-interventionist foreign policy. And it tends to, yeah, it wants thick, like a sort of thick moral religious norms to kind of pervade society, and also use the powers that they have to maintain that. Whereas juxtaposed with neoconservatism, which is far more internationalist, interventionist, and tends to see social life as, I would say, as a sort of interchangeable economic thing, as opposed to a thick kind of social norm. And anyway, but that's what paleoconservative is, and yeah, it's tended to be dominated, or it's Roman Catholics tend to have dominated it, which is fine. I'm friends with them, and also like Jews, like Paul Gottfried. I'm friendly with all those people, and but I just tried to make a Protestant version of that.
Thanks. Philip, what's your story? How did you come to be where you are?
I'll give the short version, but back in high school, when I first, I guess, kind of started taking my faith seriously, I was drawn to the Reformed tradition. Didn't grow up in it, and I joined a PCA church where the associate pastor taught a series of classes called influential books that started with the ancient world and moved into the modern American history, pre and post Civil War, and in the sort of Reformation era class, we read Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, and that was the first time I'd ever thought seriously about how my faith interacted with politics, and it really excited me. And so, going into college, I knew that was the kind of thing that I wanted to study. I just didn't really know that there was this discipline called political theory where you kind of do that stuff. So I became interested in that through undergrad. Took some really excellent classes. Also was influenced, I think, by some overlapping people that Stephen was talking about, some sources within this broader American conservative tradition, some leaning more paleoconservative, some more, I guess, neocon or other various groups. But then I went to grad school because I didn't know what else to do with my life. And right when I got there, effectively second semester into my third semester, there is when Patrick Deneen came out with this book, Why Liberalism Failed, that everybody was talking about. And so I was already sort of plugged into that world. I had gone to Front Porch Republic conferences and heard Rod Dreher speak and read the Benedict option. And so I was sort of primed to really like this book and his critiques of liberalism. And so this is a conversation I guess I've been paying attention to, at least, if not always directly involved in, probably since that sort of 2016 to 2018 window. And yeah, this now I'm fortunate enough to have found a job where I get to go teach politics and keep talking about books that I like. So it's cool.
A harder and harder thing to do in academia. So congratulations. Jerry, yeah, same question.
Grew up Baptist, and my wife and I looked for a place that had a residency program and a seminary. So we ended up in Orlando at RTS Orlando, and then we moved out to Grand Rapids because my wife's from Grand Rapids. And I started in the PhD program at Calvin. My dissertation, which I didn't finish, but was on Jonathan Edwards' use of typology and the nature of doctrine as a correction to George Lindbeck's The Nature of Doctrine. And so currently, I was under care in the Great Lakes Presbytery for 15 years, I think, but decided not to become a pastor. And I've been a ruling elder now for 4 years. I'm a COVID ruling elder because I was ordained outside in the parking lot in 2020. So, yeah, I have, like 3 or 4 books outlined right now that I'm working on. So, and I love being a ruling elder and shepherding the people. So that's the best part.
Great. Thanks so much. All right, let's get off to the races. We'll have each one again. We'll go Stephen, Philip, Jerry. How do you guys define Christian nationalism? It's been outlined lots of different ways, but I'll let each one of you give an outline.
Yeah, so the difference between my definition and others would be that I use the term and I argue for it as comprehensively as I can. So I didn't go out, I didn't do these Aristotelian things where you go out and survey, what do people say about this term? And then I interact with that. I don't do anything like that. In fact, like in the early part of the book, I essentially, not disavow, but I essentially say that whatever people have said about this is actually irrelevant to what I'm arguing for. And the irony is that some of the sociologists who want to talk about the Christian nationalism, which they say it is a thing, they've essentially made it a thing because they find a set of beliefs and then call that Christian nationalism. But me, I actually take the term Christian nationalism, and I argue that it's a nation so it's a people group or a nation that understands itself to be a Christian, both a people and a Christian people. And on that basis, they seek to arrange themselves in light of that self-knowledge through customs, through traditions and laws, and with that, with the end, the purpose of essentially their complete good, and that good would be both the earthly things that we enjoy, good vocations, good homes, good families, a strong civic life, those sorts of earthly things or temporal goods, as they've been called, but also the higher things too. The higher things would be eternal good. So again, it's a people, a Christian people, a Christian nation, saying in light of who we are and what we are, we're going to then arrange ourselves to Christian goods, and then that's going to be through custom and law, for our good, for ourselves and our posterity. And that includes both earthly things and heavenly things. So that's my definition. And then I spend, like 400 pages, explicating that definition. So that is my definition.
Yeah, I usually don't go about trying to define it because as I've seen it used most often, I think it's a fairly useless term. So as Stephen was saying, and as he outlines in the intro, there's a variety of like sort of public commentators and scholars who have said, well, what I mean by Christian nationalism, or in some cases, what I mean by white Christian nationalism is XYZ set of beliefs that we can find on a survey that cluster together, and we think that's its own sort of identifiable thing. And then you find, for example, like the Christianity Today piece that you sent us, Rob, has a definition that I find it's too strongly America-centric to be actually useful if you want to know anything about this concept, if it is a meaningful concept at all. So one thing I do appreciate about, before we get into our disagreements, and I'm sure will come out, is that there's in the world that Stephen and I both kind of come from in political theory, there's been a move in recent scholarship to stop doing what some people have done for a long time, which is try to define a term in this sort of like concrete way and then go and apply it to history and say, well, that person fits this definition because that person fits this definition because, but instead to look at how proponents of an idea have articulated it and defended it and how so and why. And so you see this in studies like of liberalism, where Patrick Deneen says, well, here's what liberalism is, this list of propositions, and I think that's bad because XYZ. Scholars like Helena Rosenblatt will say, well, let's go look at what liberals said about themselves, why they called themselves liberals, etc. So I think this book is really useful for that. As Stephen said, this is one of the only things that I found of somebody saying, unironically, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist and this is what it means and I'm going to defend it. The other people that I see sort of owning the term are just sort of using it to stick it to the journalists who are using it. Well, like, I guess if you think Christian nationalist is somebody who thinks more people in this nation should be Christian, then I'm a Christian nationalist, right? So it's rare to find somebody who actually says, well, this is what I mean by it and this is why it's good. So I think it's useful for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say much more than what you guys said, but I think you have lots of different versions right now, the theonomic, although some theonomists would deny that they're Christian nationalists, although Doug Wilson does use the term. And then I don't know what you would call Deaver's sort of Christian nationalism, which I think is also different than those. And Stevens is obviously different than, and I think that's what's been confusing for a lot of people, is that they associate it with Wilson, and I think they carry over certain preconceived ideas that and apply it to your book, and it's definitely different than what Wilson and Theonomist put out. So
Yeah, I'll just, even though I'm moderator, there's also kind of a discussion. I will say I very much dislike how especially mainstream liberal media will be like, oh, you want, your desire for the nation is for the nation to be Christian, be a majority Christian, whatever that might mean. Therefore, you are a Christian nationalist. There you are. Therefore, you are a fascist. And I think each one of those jumps is, at the very least, not informed to being not great, because that would mean I am a fascist Christian nationalist, because I also desire not only for America, but the world to be Christianized, and how that goes about could be different. But I'll just also throw my hat in the ring and say that is a desire of mine. Matthew 28:17. Go out and make Christians of all, baptizing everyone throughout the world. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so like activist sociologists have, well, I mean, what they're doing is they have these the set of questions that they do in surveys, and some of them are ambiguous. Like I look at them and like, well, I could see how that could be answered yes, but for 5-6 different reasons, or no for 5 or 6 different reasons. And then they say, well, if you respond to this survey and that's Christian nationalism, and then there's like, oh, well, this percentage of people are Christian nationalists, and then they essentially they like reify, they make it a thing where it wasn't, there's no sort of Christian nationalist or like organization that these people are part of. They're not, they might be going somewhat to the same rallies, but some are charismatic, some are like Presbyterian, and then it extends so broadly that it's like, well, but in the end, what I mean, I think there's just a relationship between academia and journalism. And so what you get, you have the Samuel Perrys, Andrew Whitehead, Philip Gorski, and they are the guys with the PhDs at the universities. And then you can cite them as experts on Christian nationalism. And so the journalist calls up and said, Samuel, this guy said this, is that Christian nationalist? Sam's like, yes, that's Christian nationalism. And so then the journalist quotes him. It's like, oh, well, the expert who wherever he teaches has a PhD, and he says that's Christian nationalist. So there's a sort of symbiotic relationship between academics and journalists and even government bureaucrats, and they kind of feed one another these sort of I mean, the academics lend credibility to an assertion that then the journalist repeats. So I mean, they're all kind of interrelated in the same sort of system, and it's all frankly kind of stupid. But that's what's happening in my opinion. Is it's a symbiotic.
Yeah, I think also the only way you can really know a long-term something is to ask the same question over decades, and we only have a few polls like that from Gallup or Pew, mainly about gun rights and abortion, that even if the question is asked not great, at least you have like 30 or 40 years of data there. Whereas if you're getting a flash poll, or if you're getting just a poll for a short amount of time for whatever political or sociological thing that is, it's not great. But let's flip it. And Jerry, what do you think is emphasized more in Christian nationalism, the Christian part or the nationalism part, based off either your definition or any definition given here?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on, I mean, once again, it comes back to this idea of nationalism. And I think in a lot of people's minds, they're associating nationalism with movements in the 20th century. So whether it's Italy or, Germany and so forth. And so, yeah. Here's my question, I guess, for the two of you. How would you define nationalism in terms of the 20th century of Italy, and how is that distinguished from what's going on today, maybe?
Yes, I'll let Philip answer that,
Okay.
and then Stephen, just because Stephen went long the last time, we'll let Philip start.
Yeah, I'm interested in this question as well, and I'll springboard really quickly before I answer it, or try to say, maybe as a follow up to Stephen, or on that question to Stephen. I'd be interested, if we can in this conversation, to find any sort of examples or particulars. As we're going to get down this list of questions, and we want to talk about the definition of a nation. I think you define nationalism clearly, and Christian nationalism as a subspecies clearly, but sort of what a nation is and how we know if we found one is a little bit more amorphous. And you kind of intentionally say that you want to not lean too heavily on historical examples because you're not interested in defending any of these historical examples. You're laying out propositions and then want to say what follows from them. And I appreciate that. I just, in terms of what we do now, in terms of applying it and finding, am I a part of a nation? What nation am I a part of? I'm interested in particular answers to that. I think it's interesting. You bring up like Italy and things like this. I've been doing, because of the past 5 years, 10 years of discourse, I guess. Been reading more about like fascist movements and things like this, and it's interesting to note, I guess, that historically nationalism is not always kind of an intrinsic part of fascism. It comes with it sometimes. It kind of doesn't sometimes, and this is another case where looking for definitions is quite hard. You have people like Umberto Eco trying to find this fascism, that we can find this list of definitions and always say that someone belongs to it. You have other people with more sort of honed in, palingenetic ultra nationalism, whatever that is. But I would say, like, I think we can meaningfully distinguish between these things because, for example, the current nationalism in many countries today across Europe and in the United States doesn't have a lot of the characteristics of what we think of as like European fascist nationalism, paramilitary stuff, maybe some cases anti-Semitism, but that depends on who you're talking to, I guess. So I would want to say we can meaningfully distinguish between these things. And so I would want to say that I think it's perfectly possible to be a nationalist and not have all of this baggage with it. It does obviously introduce the questions that I'm always interested in hearing people answer, which you don't always get clear answers to.
So Phil,
yeah. Are we defining national? I don't know what.
But yeah, I was about to say, Phil, could you condense that answer into like?
Well, I think Jerry's question was like, how does the current nationalism that we're describing or noticing in the world, or that we're advocating for potentially, relate to sort of 20th century nationalist movements? And I would want to say, I guess, that insofar as they meet that base definition of nationalism, working for the good of our nation, not necessarily at the expense of, but as opposed to the good of other nations, they share similarities. I would just also want to say they have important differences, and I wouldn't want to conflate them quickly or easily. But my question, to kind of take Jerry's question of like, how does 20th century nationalist movements compare to what we have now, is also, what is a nation in this definition of nationalism?
Yeah. So Jerry, could you re-ask that question maybe so Stephen can answer how he can?
Yeah. Basically, what would be your definition for 20th century nationalism? It seems to me that in some ways this doesn't necessarily characterize what you're doing or anything like that. So I was hesitant to say this because I don't want to compare, everybody wants to compare to the Nazis or whatever, and I'm not trying to do that, but it seems like nationalist movements try and they come up with a definition for what the nation is. And often it's based on either a mythical founding of the nation or an idealization of what the nation is supposed to be, that often excludes others that don't fit within the definition.
So I think that sounds like, how would Stephen define nationalism, both currently and like, should there be any weight on that from
how do you come
to
a definition of what the particularity of the nation is or is supposed to be? Because it seems like often when that happens, it excludes others. And what happened in the 20th century is then the others that are excluded then get blamed for the problems of the nation.
So. Well, I'd first say that like we always, like, every nation excludes certain people. So if you come out and you're anti-Semitic, or you believe in IQ differences between races, it's good bet that you're going to be canceled from your academic job, or perhaps your even job, maybe you lose your entire livelihood. So it's just actually the case that every nation, including our nation, is perfectly willing to exercise power. And I'm assuming everyone here would exercise the power they have. If you're at Covenant College and some guy comes out and says he agrees with Martin Luther about the Jews, I'm assuming that, Philip, you would be active in getting that guy removed from his position. So everyone is interested in exercising power to exclude. So it's a liberal myth that somehow we don't do that. So it's just first of all, I don't think it's unique to, I don't know, 20th century nationalism or fascism or whatever. Every nation has its, let's say, their blasphemy laws. It just depends on who's God, I guess. So anyway, I don't, when I define like nationalism, I don't go into 20th century stuff. I would just I don't really care if there is overlap or if there isn't, because I'm not overly sensitive to this. We have a sort of predisposition to be like, the worst thing you can be is like a Nazi. And so we essentially organize our entire thinking in politics with that in mind. And so instead of me thinking, oh, how do I make sure I'm not a Nazi, or I don't get accused of being a Nazi, or, like the whole, what is it, Gore Vidal and Bill Buckley's, like Bill Buckley was willing to punch a guy in the nose over being accused of being Nazi. I'm not really that sort of person. And so when I went in to describe Christian nationalism, I said, what do I think a nation is? And how is that nation preserved? And in what ways are the goods of that nation conserved and provided for? And then I essentially said that nationalism is again, it's the people identifying themselves as something, as a people, and then seeking to arrange themselves in light of that. And that doesn't have to be, I mean, some of these things are just subtle and not 100% deliberate. I guess one thing about 20th century nationalism might be that it's more deliberate, I guess, that it's like a sort of asserted program, and then by force, everyone's sort of brought into it, but as if compelled. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. So I think most of the time, a lot of what we believe and what we do is just something all sort of second nature that we've been taught to do in these circumstances, or ways to think, what seems appropriate and suitable and what seems inappropriate. And so in that sense, nationalism, to my definition, could be as natural of an interaction among people as Mayberry is when you watch the Andy Griffith Show. There's nothing in that show that seems as if someone's forcing them to act in this very kind of fitting, decent way of life. And yet, if you kind of look at it closely, there are customs and ways that are built into that way of life that they, I think, when threatened, would want to preserve. But anyway, the fact of the matter is, like, in defining nationalism as a historical phenomenon, there are as many definitions as there are researchers, and they disagree about what it is. People want to list several cases of nationalism and then sort of compare it to see what are the common features of it, which in a way is sort of question begging, because they're already choosing the cases. And so it's really not, I don't find it very interesting, frankly. As someone who's trying to do political theory and philosophy, I just wanted to avoid the entire quagmire that is the discussion over nationalism, and just assert what I think to be true, according to human nature. And I don't know if that helps, but like, I just, frankly, I can understand why people would want to as a historical question. But for me, I didn't really, the reason I use nationalism is because I think there are things called nations, and that those nations can be self-aware, in a collective sense. And as being self-aware, they can then have a recognition that they need to organize themselves for their good, for their collective good. So, so for that reason, I just didn't care. But yeah.
And for that, it's almost interesting how I guess us as Americans having citizenship that's birthright instead of earned, like actually much the world has, or even that our immigration laws are much looser. Like if you want to immigrate to Canada, it is significantly harder than it is to immigrate to the United States. It's significantly harder to immigrate to a lot of other places in the world, especially desirable developed countries. So that does make a little bit since. Notoriously, after Trump got elected, there was a big, like, how hard is it to immigrate to Canada article in the New York Times. And the sum of it was like, it's actually really hard even for Americans to immigrate to Canada or maybe Australia or something like that. That kind of actually naturally flows, Stephen, into another question I had, which was like, I guess, is there a, and this Philip can kind of jump in on this too, is there is some historical baggage to nationalism. I get your definition. What about like patriotism? Are they essentially the same side of the coin, or are you also just kind of like, I don't, patriotism on July 4th, yay. Nationalism is more of a ideology, governance structure, so they don't actually interact that much. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you can distinguish them. I don't think you can exactly separate patriotism and the type of nationalism I've described. I mean, I suppose you could be very patriotic and simply because you like certain propositions or you like, some phrase that the founder said at one time. But I mean, it seems to me that the most sacrificial element of patriotism is deeply rooted in a sense of place that goes back generations. That you love the town you live in, you love the nation you live in part because you have people, your loved ones participated in it. I mean, to me, it seems that like your love of home, your love of place, is just another extension of a sort of love of family because your family has sacrificed here. It's like a love of your grandparents' home after they die. Maybe you drive by, or maybe you own it, and this is a place where your grandfather built this deck or planted this field and worked that field, and that all means something to people. And I think people are ordinarily patriotic because the place itself means something to them in a particular way, because of their ancestral connection to it, or at the very least their familial connection to it. I mean, most people who sign up for infantry in the military, they tend to have a story of, my father was in the army, my grandfather was in the army, my great grandfather died or fought in World War II, or whatever it is. They have some family history that explains why they join. And that's not true for everyone, of course, but it's often true for the infantryman or the Marine who joins. And that's yeah. So it's I would say it's like, at the very least, to be, I mean, I guess you could be patriotic without nationalist, but ordinarily, if you're nationalist, you're also patriotic.
I think the best, I don't know how useful it is to distinguish these terms. Some people like to, and I think it's fair. Something that Samuel Goldman points out in his book After Nationalism is that patriotism is much older in the American lexicon than nationalism is. Nationalism as a term comes into sort of American parlance post Civil War during some sort of nativist movements and things like this. So patriotism has a sort of longer genealogy back in American history. I think it was George Parkin Grant who said something like his conception of patriotism is a sort of imaginative, forward-looking projection about your nation, that it's a sort of aspirational thing, thinking about what it could be ideally or in the future. And nationalism is actually sort of a backwards-looking imaginative projection that looks to some maybe founding moment or some sort of pre-existent nation that you feel some sort of loyalty to. So I think this goes to maybe Jerry's concern and question for Stephen. That I'll sort of say a couple of things, and then if Stephen wants to expound further, I'd be interested, because I think Jerry's concern with comparing to 20th century nationalist movements, which I understand why you want to sort of not use these historical examples because you don't have any particular loyalty to them. That's fine, but the question I think that Jerry's hitting at is like exclusion on the basis of what, and unity on the basis of what. So I think you're right. It is kind of a liberal myth that we don't practice exclusion. Any nation that exists today has citizenship and excludes people who aren't citizens from all sorts of goods and services and participation in civic life. But they're also unified around something. Maybe it's matrilineal descent, maybe it's birthright citizenship, maybe it's something like this. But they've united around something that here's who's in and here's who's out. It's an answer to one of these fundamental questions of political theory of belonging and citizenship. And so I think the fear, the concern, as that a lot of people have about this project is that it might be too exclusionary or unified over too narrow of a set of things. And so some things from the book that I find really interesting, you have this, I love this Augustine quote that you use from the City of God, pages 143 and 144, where he says, you kind of rather hang out with your dog than another person who you can't share a language with because it's just so frustrating. I think it's fair. And then you go on to say, since language is particular and necessary for civil fellowship, it follows that at least some particularity is a prerequisite for civil fellowship. And I think so far, you've got everybody on board, right? I think everybody would kind of agree, maybe not, but I think almost everybody would agree that some particularity, especially language and some sort of commonality, maybe common human nature as well, grounds that civil fellowship. But there's another passage you quote a little bit earlier on page 141 from Aquinas where he says that likeness causes love of friendship or well-being for the very fact that two men are alike, having as it were one form, makes them to be in a manner one in that form. But the sentence that goes right before that, Aquinas says that likeness is a quality that tends to produce love. And a quality for Aquinas includes a lot of things, some of which I think you're hitting on are kind of morphological, right? There are similarities between species of animals that are qualities that let us lump them together. But there are also qualities that are things like habit and character. And so this is a question I had kind of all throughout is sort of why there isn't more optimism about grounding civic fellowship or unity on qualities of character, particularly, but the theological virtues, right? There seems to be, as you say in several places, yes, we recognize we may be united with Christians all over the world in our heavenly aims, but that doesn't mean that we fit neatly together in political community together. Those people worshiping in house churches in China have a very different culture and language than me. We can't neatly form a political community. Makes sense. But I'm slightly more optimistic, I guess, about the idea that, two people of similar character, both pursuing God from quite different backgrounds, can come together in a similar location and then ground that as some sort of unity that produces friendship, which, as Aristotle says, is like the most important thing for politics. The political leader cares more about friendship than he does about justice, even, because you can have an unjust city, but if you have no friendship, you have no city at all. I wonder, like, what are the qualities you think are really grounding this unity, and how do I know them when I find them?
Yeah, I'd say when you find them is that when with these other people you can achieve the greatest good in collective life. If you are just like in language, for example, you don't have the same language, like Augustine says, that essentially the same as dogs together, and Calvin has something similar to say about that. And so if you don't share that, you can't even at a very basic level exercise common humanity. So like you said, that is a particular thing. So in that sense, propositions are not enough. There actually is a particular thing that people could disagree on or have differences over that would make them unsuitable for civil fellowship. But there's also things about you have traditions of punctuality. You have basic understandings of like a historical sort of connection to people in place and way things are done. Everything from in your particular vocation to the way politics is handled, to an understanding of how law is supposed to operate in relation to, like, say economic life, in governmental programs. The fact is that the Anglo tradition is very much a tradition of ordered liberty, and one that is not does not have the emphasis on sort of like redistributive type of political programs. So if you have someone in political life who would vote for that, as opposed to you have a more sense of more decentralized or more kind of a free economic system, then those would clash as well. And I would just point in, I think, American history, that's precisely what's happened, by the way. But so there are like disagreements over how you arrange your collective life, and those come to clash in politics. So yeah, it's and this is why people tend to group around their ethnic fellows, and this is why even in the military you see people in the mess hall, or the DFAC as we call it, people grouped around racial lines and ethnic lines, even though they're wearing the same exact uniform. And that's because the ease of conversation, similar interest in culture and lifestyle things and music and upbringing, all these things are similar, where people naturally, when they have a choice, they group together. And that's because they can get the maximal friendship out of that. And I'd say, I mean, this is essentially what you mentioned, Aristotle and friendship. I mean, he recognized this in both, I think, Politics 3 and 5. I don't know. Anyway, the idea that dissimilarity creates actions within civil polity, and that a polis essentially is one where you have similar people seeking the common good. But I also think that the difficulty, like when people say, I want like a geometric, precise definition of what a nation is and how I can walk into it and find it, and where the boundaries are to it, and how to make sure someone's in or out of it, it's asking something that the subject matter itself doesn't even permit. I mean, there's some questions, and this comes from Aristotle as well. There's some questions that you can't, it's like, at what point is someone immodest in dress? Like, at what point is a woman wearing something too revealing? You know, it's hard to pinpoint a precise point, but you know it when you see it. And on either side. And so the same thing with nations. Sometimes it's very obvious, and sometimes it's not. But sometimes there's margins, and sometimes there's not. But
it seems like, though,
yeah.
at times you seem to say you may not know it when you see it, right? That there can be people who are part of a nation who aren't fully aware of it, which is why you sort of need to do this, like, consciousness heightening. You need to become more aware of your actual belonging. And so it seems like it's not always the case that I know it when I see it. In fact, I might need to actually go through a process of teaching myself to be aware of it, or unlearning some psychological things that I may have been taught in this sort of like post-war period that you're criticizing, especially in the epilogue, which is a lot of fun. I wonder if there's like a sort of chicken and egg problem in a sense. And what I mean by that is like, and this is just an example, not an accusation in any way, please. But like, if I, like some of my friends from high school, start hanging out in some weird internet subcultures, and I start imbibing a lot of actual white nationalist propaganda, I am going to have a heightened sense of my own identity as a white person. It's become what, in political science we call salient now, by my exposure to the discourse around it. And that similar kind of thing happened during the Obama presidency, and all the discourse around race. We see an uptick in sort of racial awareness and identification in minority groups. And so I just wonder, like, how much I'm sort of creating something that's not there to begin with, versus recognizing that something that is there. And that idea of potentially like creating something that is not there is, I think, the optimistic side of a more expansive or diverse kind of nationalism, that says actually you can have a quite disparate group of people that can find some common ground to unite over, whether that might be religion or character, or some precipitating founding moment like a Revolutionary War, that can sort of coalesce all of these things into one that were previously quite disparate.
Yeah, I mean, you just again, like imagine in Mayberry, all of a sudden there's a mosque and they're doing public mosque prayers. Wouldn't that seem out of place? So there's, again, it's a question of modesty, where like what's, wearing a bikini is probably is clearly immodest, but then the line between the actual fine line is not clear. So I think you can say some things are out of place and some things are fuzzy. But you can recognize like the principle of the matter, which is that you're able to achieve your activities in the world when you can maximally understand that other person, and you can have the same interests, you can have the same customs, you have the same ways of you say being in the world, I guess, and that maximizes the ease of your life and projects. When people are free to choose let's say their business partners, they tend to choose business partners that might have a different skill set but ordinarily they'd want to choose one which they have the same values, the same interest, and ease of communication. And that could be someone who has different ancestry than you, but nevertheless, you still would choose someone whom you think you can interact with for a common purpose. And this would say this also would be true for political life.
Very good. As much as rabbit holes as we can go down, I'd like to move on to just different topic that we can all go around again. We'll start with Jerry, since Jerry saved his voice for our listeners. Jerry has COVID right now, but he still very thankfully is on. We'll let him go first since he saved his voice for a little bit. What are some or the theological underpinnings of Christian nationalism, especially within our Protestantism broadly, since we're all Protestants, and or Presbyterianism specifically, like possibly within Westminster Governor's Standards. So however you want to answer that broadly, Jerry, specifically on your own, how do you view the theological underpinnings of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't agree with the theological underpinnings of Christian nationalism. So, but I mean, I think a lot of Stephen's project is a reflection on the magisterial Reformation. And I understand all that. But to me, it seems that there's no permanence to that. I mean, none of the countries that had the magisterial Reformation maintained that. They're all, so like part of my question is for Stephen, I guess, is how do you think that Christian nationalism, if it came to reality, which I think is partially unlikely, or really unlikely probably, but how would there be any permanence to that? Because one of the things that I don't see in the book is any sort of notion of sin or corruption, and that is happening within Christians themselves, or even people that are not necessarily Christian, but there's no sense of the actual corruption that you see, and we've seen corruption in Christian leaders and Christian princes in the past, and it seems to undermine the nationalist movement, or in that sense.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'll jump in a minute. I think it's from Weight of Glory, but it's not. It's from a recent essay within the Weight of Glory book, where like Lewis thinks that the worst form of liberalism governance is somewhat theocracy. But again, moderator, I don't want to say too much, but we'll let was that a direct question to Stephen, or should Philip
anybody wants to answer? But let me just add one other thing too, is because you talk about this a little bit in the book, but we even see like sort of the corruption of the sacraments in some of the magisterial, or even in the Puritans and so forth, especially baptism, because baptism gets associated then with being part of the nation and having, land ownership and all these other things. And you get things like the halfway covenant, where, people that had been baptized as infants want their children to be baptized, even though they haven't been converted. So it seems like it undermines the sacraments in a lot of ways. Anyways, I just think you can kind of see this, that there's a corruption, that there's no permanence to it, and eventually, at least from the pattern we've seen in history, it falls away. There's no lasting.
So you would define Christian nationalism, its theological underpinnings, as basically a governance structure that is somewhat tied to citizen rights tied to baptism, or
well, it's part of it. That's kind of what has happened, or had happened.
Okay, but Phil, why don't you give your overview of that? We'll let Stephen answer next.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I understand the case that Stephen is making, the underpinnings are, as he takes them, broadly historically reformed. So he's starting with certain ideas about, well, first, what's natural to man pre-fall and post-fall, but also, what the two orders of our loves towards heavenly things and earthly things, and how those things can be sort of reconciled in the best form of every life, right? The best, natural man life versus the best Christian life, the best family versus the best Christian family, the best nation versus the best Christian nation. And relying, of course, on the sort of classical two kingdoms distinction that says, yeah, there are lines of separation between what the civil magistrate can do and what the church does. One holds the sword, one holds the sacraments, and these things shouldn't be muddled. They need to be kept distinct. I think that's very well historically grounded, even in the most like what people like to think of as theocratic governments that you see in the magisterial period, in Calvin's Geneva and whatever. These lines were fairly well kept distinct. And another point of appreciation before we inevitably wrap back around to more disagreements is I appreciate Stephen's critique of David Van Drunen's form of kind of radical two kingdoms political theology. I find that unconvincing as well. The hard line of separation between the church and the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man, that there's no such thing really as like a Christian institution or a Christian et cetera, that I think those critiques are very fair. I think, though, as Stephen has articulated it, I think he would say that this is sort of the testimony of the classical and Reformed tradition on what politics ought to be like. I'm not convinced it's nearly as homogenous as maybe he suggested, but the premises are there, and he's taking them in places that I might find some off ramps along the way. But I think there's interesting and good grounding within the Reformed tradition. But interesting question we might have time to get to is like, what do you do when you expand your Christian polity beyond the Reformed tradition, right? I have many good friends who are very conservative Lutherans who have quite a different view of even two kingdoms theology, the sacraments especially. How might we think of a pan-Protestant Christian nation dealing with those sorts of things? I think is an interesting question to be answered.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. So theologically, like one of the core principles that's kind of been touched on, not directly, but is the idea of grace does not destroy nature. And I think it's very classical, it's Thomistic, but it's prior to him. And then it's kind of reflected into kingdom theology and all that. So that's the idea that whatever is naturally good for man, by natural meaning what he is as a human being, and those goods are not eliminated by grace. So if it is the case that a certain degree of cultural homogeneity within a civil community is necessary ordinarily for a civil community to achieve its highest end, or sufficiency, as Aristotle would say, then that remains so after grace. And if the content of that similarity is more than just you share in religious life, but you share in pastimes, customs, ways, a sense of form of government, laws, heritage, great sacrifices in the past, and all blah blah blah. Then if that's true, then grace doesn't change that, and that's central to my project. Essentially, the continuity of natural goods after grace. So I think that's a major theological underpinning of it, but also like the Christian part. I don't think people realize. Like I think that so I think nations are essentially natural, or naturally arise from human interaction over time, and the Christian part is it doesn't sort of doesn't destroy the goods of a nation. It does perfect it. It is the sort of completeness that of the whole that doesn't eliminate the parts. And it sends to, you could say, color, or it shapes, you could say, the way of life. It corrects and it perfects. So that means a Christian nation, let's say a nation is not Christian, but then it becomes Christian. They don't lose their characteristics, other than what's correct. The sin is corrected, but they don't lose who they are. Just like all of us. If you're not a Christian at one point, you have a certain personality. I have a certain personality myself, and I became a Christian when I was 17. There's continuity of personhood, let's put it that way, from pre-grace, post-grace, and yet grace corrects, grace perfects, but it doesn't destroy that what I was. So it's not as if there's one little personality type that we all seek towards. We're all different, and the same thing with nations. So that's my, I don't know if that's I guess that's a theological thing, but I'm just making distinctions between how theology proper or revealed theology interacts with what's natural or prior to revealed theology.
Can I ask a follow-up
Yeah.
question on that? Like, so in your last answer, you mentioned, the sorts of we're interested maybe in the kinds of dissimilarity that keep us from having the civic fellowship. And you just said, if it's true naturally that there's a certain degree of cultural homogeneity that's necessary for civic fellowship, that doesn't go away through grace. I somewhat agree with that, although I do think, again, you might maybe be underestimating the way that the perfection part of grace perfecting nature, that perhaps on that common ground of shared membership in the kingdom of God, we can overcome certain dissimilarities that we might not be able to by nature, the sort of like descriptive versus prescriptive thing. But my concern or my question, I guess, is like, you say a certain degree of cultural homogeneity is necessary. And the question I think everybody has for you in this project, and the concerns that most people have, is just how much? Because again, I think up to the point where you say, well, yeah, at least we've got to have a common language, right? There's got to be something there, right? Yes, everybody's on board. And then you maybe start adding things to it, and people start kind of getting off along the way. So in the same way, you go through later in the book and talk about, how a Christian prince might want to distinguish between primary and secondary and tertiary issues in terms of arranging the civil government so that the heavenly ends are best facilitated. At a certain point in our churches, right, we have lines of demarcation that say, well, this degree of dissimilarity means you either need to repent or you're out. And in the same way, maybe in the civic fellowship, we say this level of dissimilarity means you maybe can't come in, or maybe you need to go out once you're here. So how much dissimilarity or how much homogeneity is necessary is I think the burning question that everybody has, and where it comes from, right? How much of this homogeneity ends up being sort of like aspirational and habitual, right? So you mentioned a couple of things that I think people recognize. We've seen the posters of this is white culture, is punctuality and all these things, but how much of that is like habitual and malleable if someone aspirationally wants to belong to this political community, versus how much of it is fixed according to, well, I just was sort of taught this way, and now I've been alive long enough to where that can never change, and now I can never have civic fellowship with that person.
Yeah. So I agree, and I say in the book that people can be people over time, if they choose to immigrate into a settled people, they one have an obligation not to essentially meddle in that people's way of life. Just like a good guest wouldn't do that at someone's home. The host does have an obligation of hospitality, but that's not a sort of absolute obligation that can be kind of rescinded, just like in our homes. And but people can be grafted in over time, and sometimes that could take generations. And that generational thing, I mean, it's like Aristotle says it, Aquinas says it. It just makes sense that you'd have the second or third generation would be the people who begin to embody the way of life of the people in which they're settling. And
so what happens to the first and second generation in the meantime, I guess, is my question. How do you ever get to that third and fourth generation if we're sort of assuming I can't have civic fellowship with the first and second generation?
Well, but I'm just saying, like, the fullness of civic fellowship. Like, certainly we've all interacted with people who have broken English. It's hard to communicate what you're saying. So, it's not as if, oh, you're just similar, you're out. You can practice like respect, and if they're in a ditch or on the side of the road, you should help them out and pay their medical bills, despite whether they are your culture or not your culture. But I mean, it's just, when I say they can't practice civic fellowship, I'm just stating a matter of fact and interaction. I don't mean as some sort of official like policy thing. It's just a fact of just life and experience. If you meet a guy and he has a very different value system than you, or you're not going to cooperate with him in a grand project. So, I mean, this is, well, I don't want to go back to the military, but yeah, I mean, what the questions you're asking are very difficult ones because we're sorting through, because what I'm not asserting like this program that says you're brown, you're out. I'm not asserting a program that says if you barely speak English, get on the bus, you're going back. What I am saying though is if that it's a good thing that there are goods at stake for any community, whether it's in Uganda or it's in Venezuela or it's in France or it's in South Carolina or North Carolina. There are goods at stake that when you have masses of people who are different come in and there's no expectation of assimilation, then you have a disruption of the way of life of a people, and potentially, most likely, in the long run, factions between the different groups, unless there's some some means of bringing people in. So this isn't like I don't know. I've said before, this isn't like a racial thing in terms of fixed biology, as if, white people have a certain thing, and then if you're brown, you're not going to be able, you're not going to be brought into this thing. I've been very outspoken about. I don't do the condemn this or that game, but in a positive sense, I've been very open with people who. One of my friends is like literally was born in Mexico, and when I talk to the guy, he is like, I love this country. I want my children to be this is my word, and it was essentially engrafted into this great place. And there's a lot of people like that. There's also people who are not like that. They want it as an economic zone. They want to retain the culture they had somewhere else. And that's fine in small numbers, but if it's large numbers, it becomes ethnic enclaves, and so anyway, I could keep rambling on about that. It's a very difficult question, I admit, but it's like it's one of these things that if a bunch of white people are moving down to Mexico City with their money and they start transforming Mexico City from this Mexican place to a white, upper middle class place, we'd all be like, oh, that's horrible. They're going there and they're gentrifying. They're doing this and that. We'd all like condemn that. But when it comes here with the majority white population, it's like, well, we should be open and should be diversity, and what really is the border between culture and that. I mean, so we're very willing to do this in other places. It's just when it's like a preoccupation of ourselves to even ask the question for ourselves.
Do you think that is too much assuming a capital D democratic liberal progressive mindset? Because I think that's actually a pretty broad understanding of a nation, whether it's too many Turks in Germany, too many Algerians in France, too many Canadians in America. I think I think it's actually pretty understandable not only to have some fixed literal and metaphorical borders to a nation, but also like some of the highest polling against, for example, the Biden administration right now, besides the economy, is the state of the border. I mean, that's like 60% for Democrats alone. That's even higher for Black Democrats, and it's really high for randomly Latinos. It's obviously extremely high for white Republicans across the board. Like that, it is, I think, understandable and not too hard of a case to make that whatever you define a nation as, there does need to be some sort of governmental structure around that. And so that's just me as the moderator coming in and giving some numbers behind that, because that's actually not too hard of a case, considering that there are if you want to immigrate to France legally, you have to have a Parisian accent. Like I'm being serious. Like,
no, I know.
The Economist has put out that if you actually want to learn an international language, it should be French, because since they have if they're not the only, they're one of the few to have a federal government program about how you pronounce French specifically. Yeah. So you can go to Syria, you can go to Algeria, you can go whatever their colony was in Southeast Asia. They're all going to have the same accent. Unlike there's Iberian Spanish, there's Mexican Spanish. They're going to have very different cultures associated with that more or less same language, right? You speak I speak American English. That's different than Australian English. That's different than British English, right? Like, and so there is going to be some sort of boundary there, whether it's nation, religion, ethnicity. I don't like using the word race because actually within genetics, blacks, whites, Asian, Hispanic, they're all actually technically the same race. Neanderthals would be a different race. That's probably neither here nor there. But that is just me kind of underlining, like, having boundaries for a nation, not that ridiculous of a concept.
Yeah, I mean, Japan is a classic example. They've kind of loosened up a bit, but I mean, just take like my own experience. I grew up in California,
Actually,
moved away many years
let me
ago.
interrupt.
Oh,
Japan's about to lessen a lot because now they have a visa for creation of future individual. You
Okay.
can now get a visa in Japan for the express purpose of making more Japanese people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, there's actually a unique case of a white guy, a family where he grew up in Japan, and you hear him speak, and he has like a Japanese accent when he speaks English, and he has the mannerisms of being Japanese. It's really fascinating. And so then you ask people, was he Japanese? And then they don't know what to do. But like, so you take someone for like me. I grew up in California, and now I live in North Carolina. I remember specifically, I said 4 years ago, I said, I'm moving to the South, or I'm settling in the South, or whatever. And I had some guy who's ideologically aligned with me entirely. He looked at me and he's like, well, like, you better not mess up our culture. Like, you better not, like, you better be conscious of the fact that you're entering a different culture.
You better you better like vinegar barbecue. If you eat any of that mustard stuff, you better move to South Carolina.
I don't know, but I'm serious. Like, so you learn these things, and then you come here, and yeah, it's not, it's not so hard to get, people are generally the same, and you can interact, but there's differences here. So this even includes like a guy I just talked to the other day. He was telling me about how, like, on his mother's side, someone owned slaves, and they weren't particularly good, like nice to, they didn't treat him well or whatever. And I was like, oh, wow, that's like, it made me realize, and that impacted the way he viewed things. And it made me realize that as a guy who California with some origins in New England and New York, earlier on in ancestry, I don't have any of that sort of background. And I'm entering into a place in which there are race relations, in which there are white people whose families did own slaves. So that's all kind of new to me. I'm not ancestrally linked to that at all. I'm like a New England guy, really. And so, anyway, the point being is that, like, I'm conscious of the fact that I live in the South. I want my kids to adopt Southern culture, Southern music, Southern food, be aware that they're in the South. And I don't want them to be little siloed Californians or whatever, up to the third and fourth generation. So that's what people are asking. Like, when someone kind of comes to a place, that they should have this sort of, they have a sort of duty to see themselves as part of a project of becoming one of the people they're moving to. In part in gratitude for the fact that they obviously want to live in a place. That place has made it possible that they can make a life there. And those people who are there are the ones who created those conditions. And so out of gratitude, as to the extent that you can, according to good conscience, you should seek to become one of them. So that's how I.
And Philip, I'll let you ask one more question, then I'd like to move on to our next topic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I believe you when you say, you're not proposing a political project of just like no brown people. But I believe you in part because of something else that I had a question about. I mentioned this before we started, but you, this lecture you gave at the new Christendom Press conference, you use language of like old stock Americans, and you specifically mentioned like pre-Ellis Island Americans. I don't know if you've used this term. I've seen you retweet it. There's this term going around that's popular in some circles of like heritage American. And so it seems like there may be even a line of distinction that you're drawing between different whitest whites like me. If anybody in the audience cares, I can trace my ancestry back to 1680s Germantown, Pennsylvania. But I guess I'm wondering, like, going back to that sort of like affective feeling awareness of my belonging to a nation, do you think there's such like a strong difference between the sort of like, yep, Ellis Island generation and those who came before? And then like, I think too, like, well, what about pockets of people who came, pre Ellis Island, who've been here just as long as many of these other old stock or quote unquote heritage Americans, such as the descendants of slaves? What do we do with that? How do you think about that? So yeah, again, I believe you that this isn't like clean, this isn't racialized, just the color of your skin, you're out, because it seems like you're drawing finer distinctions than even most of us would, just on like a visual basis. Just like there's some sort of nation maybe here that's been here longer than even people who came in the sort of like turn of the century period. So I'm just curious, like how and why you distinguish those.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of heritage American, that's something, CJ Engel, friend of mine, uses. He actually will say that like the American Indians and Blacks are heritage Americans, and that means they are connected. They have deep roots into the country that goes back, to the founding and beyond it. And so you would essentially identify with the sort of way of life and actions of those people. So that it isn't racialized. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the Ellis Island thing, so yeah, I too have roots going back to the Mayflower, but I also have roots in part going back to sort of Ellis Island. But it doesn't. Let me say that, like, broadly speaking, like, I'd say that the Ellis Island generation is a case of bringing, I would say, old world political values and injecting them into American way of life. I'd say that the New Deal, a lot of social programs are from the federal government, and expansion of the federal government is actually due to the voting bloc of Ellis Island folks. I mean, to this day, many Roman Catholic Ellis Islanders still vote for Democrats. That's of course not universally true. But I think that the idea of like a heritage American is that we set this kind of American. There was an original American sort of ethnos that was the core of our political way of life, and people can be grafted into that, just as my German and Irish heritage was, such that I don't really have it. When someone asks me what ethnicity I am, I usually kind of joke and say I'm 100% American, even though I could break it down and say I'm 10% Northern Italian and 15% Irish or something like that from 19th century immigration. But yeah, I'm essentially, the reason I say 100% American is essentially that I identify with the broad history of that project of America. But people can be grafted into it, and you don't have to be even of European descent in order to do that. Or, yeah, I mean, you can make it yourself a generational project of becoming essentially part of the host group to your immigration, if that makes sense. So it's like, in a way, how does someone who has no European ancestry begin to identify with a George Washington or even Abraham Lincoln or whatever in terms of those as great men of our people? And it's a process of seeing yourself as being brought into the we the people over time, which I think is historically true. This is how the Irish and the Germans early on became grafted in. And so, I mean, it was also like a concern of the founders. I could keep going on and on, but it's trying to recognize that there is a people that extends back through centuries that you can be connected to and identify with, and they embody the sort of core, the core ethos and principles that you want to see conserved.
Okay.
No.
If this is kind of also a question for all, Jerry has been saving his voice, so I'll let him go ahead. I know, Stephen, you didn't really outline this in your book. Maybe you can outline it a little bit here. It was referenced in your book, but we'll let everyone I'll let Stephen answer for Stephen, but Jerry and Philip, maybe each one of you can just kind of broadly outline for the Christian nationalist movement in general, what has it meant for the governing structure? Is this like adopting a new constitution, massive amount of amendments to our own constitution, a big omnibus bill, more of a culture movement type deal? What is broadly, what are some broad examples there?
Well, I mean, I guess. Oh, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say it seems like there's two groups right now. One wants to sort of bring back the Constitution and cherish it. And then now there's another group that's reacting and say the Constitution's no good anymore. We need to reboot the whole thing. So I mean, I think those are two. But as a Christian nationalist, some would want to like re-Christianize the whole founding and I have no question that there were Christian that much of our founding documents are rooted in Christianity in some way, although there are also documents that are diverse and compromise documents. That's why you have founders that were part of what I would call natural religion or deist and so forth. But most of it, there was a lot of Christian founding in the documents. Miles Smith could probably say that a lot better than I could, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I correct. Yeah, I think there are some people, I guess, in my camp who want to just get rid of the Constitution entirely. I think those people are actually very few, and in part that's it's to think that that extends to more of us is really kind of the rhetoric of our opponents more than our own. I, for example, like the Constitution. I just don't like a lot of the precedents over the last 100 years. So I would throw out much of the Warren Court in terms of the First Amendment, and I'd throw out the incorporation clause or the clause in the incorporation doctrine, and I would return to like sort of 19th century. I like 19th century religious and public life, where everyone around you said we're a Christian country, and but at the same time there could be states with soft establishments like we had until the 1830s, with religious liberty. At the same time, that with the understanding that we did, I mean, Tocqueville recognized this. Pretty much everyone recognized in the 19th century that we're, in a sort of broad sense, a Christian country, if not a Protestant country. And I'd say we were Protestant. And so I would just want to restore the Constitution as it operated in the 19th century, particularly in the early 19th century. I think it's good to have, even though I don't like a bunch of the lefties getting public money, so that could be a problem in the short run. But at least in the long run, having some kind of public funding for decent ministers, so that poor areas can have good, we'll call for ministers. But that's just like a vision, rather than maybe something we can do tomorrow. Yeah, and I think that's just American. So when I wrote the book, I didn't mention the United States until a later chapter, and also in the epilogue. The rest of it is just principles. One of those principles is, I'm a paleocon, which means that I take what the people's traditions and way of life, including their political and legal tradition, and you assume that, and you may make adjustments or changes as seed fit, just like a good Burkean would say that, a people that can't change are going to die, or whatever that quote is. And so that's the same thing. But yeah, it's more, it is, so I'm not trying to like soft code it, but it is an assertive Christianity in political life. It's the norming of Christianity in public life, which means that if you're not a Christian, then in some sense you're like a sort of I don't want to say second class is derogatory, but you are different than the norm, which can be tolerated. People can have exceptions to that, and just as people did for many years. But there would be a sense in which we're a Christian people, and people shouldn't subvert it. So that's my sense. But constitutionally, I think that all fits the Constitution as originally understood.
Yeah, I that makes sense. I'm not, I guess I'm not accusing you of softening it, but it seems to me though that even if I think you're right, right? Having read Miles Smith's most recent book, Mark David Hall and all these things, I'm fairly well convinced of what you all are saying about the sort of religion and public life and its interaction in this period. But it seems like um, I don't know. Maybe I'm still too pessimistic. Maybe I'm still too soaked in the post liberal world. But if you're putting on your kind of Patrick Deneen hat, it seems like there are things baked into the system that lead us to where we are now. If that's sort of what is it the intervening waves of immigration that got us there? And if we could have just not done that, could we have just had this nice relationship between religion and public life? It seems, at least to me, on finishing the book, that as I read like half of it a year ago, and then I finished it now in preparation for this. On finishing it, it seems like you would need some sort of like far more, I guess, stringent guardrails from this Christian Prince figure to keep things on the rails as things have a tendency to wander. It was pretty quickly, going back to Jerry's point about the historical consequences of magisterial Christian nations in the sense they meant it then. Puritan New England goes Unitarian pretty darn fast in historical sense. So like what sort of mechanism, even during the time when they were still softly established, as you said. So yeah, just what sort of mechanisms might be necessary to prevent that from happening. I imagine them being a lot more stringent than what we actually had looking backwards to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there might be. I don't actually. I'm not on the side of the integralists, so the Catholic integralists. So I'm not. I don't call myself post-liberal. Maybe I am. I don't know. I don't really care. But I don't care to be. I do care to be lumped in with those other guys. Deneen's better than some of the other post-liberal guys, but yeah, I don't agree with Deneen's understanding of the founding. And I think it's been essentially refuted by several different people, many people, and but I don't think there was something inevitable in it. So I don't think they. I mean, as things progressed, of course, we are what we have now. But I just think that's true of anything. I don't know. I was talking to a guy the other day, and it was like, he was like, well, do we then not start a church because a church, as things go in history, become liberal and left wing, or they become Unitarian? I mean, it's like you have to see some good in the world. You have to take the risk of the project, and things degrade. I don't know. I mean, liberalism, I'd say, has degraded pretty bad in for whenever it originated, whatever that is. But it seems to have degraded, and I'm sure liberals would say it wasn't baked into liberalism. They'd have some other explanation for it, and I think it's this similar what I would say. But yeah, would you need? I think it's a like any civil community. It's law is trying to combat some sin or restrain some sin or promote some good that the people and their customs have either failed to restrain or and so if you need more law to restrain some sin, and it's a prudent law, doesn't overthrow the Commonwealth and all that, then yeah, that would be good. I mean, that's there's definitely a possibility that you would need more kind of stringent laws than what we've had historically, I suppose. I'm not opposed to that in principle. Again, it's like it's a matter of what's the program for the anyway. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I just don't know, but I'm not afraid to say that you'd have to have stronger laws in certain areas that we haven't had in the past. So
Before we're about an hour 15 minutes in, so I want to try to bring us home real quick. Jerry, if you don't mind, Stephen, Jerry and Phil have one short question to ask you if necessary, and then I've got to kind of bring together wrap up question for all this.
You want to go, Phil?
Yeah, sure. I guess I did not. Yeah, just I'll try to keep it brief. A question I had, again, this is something that you mentioned in your your speech from Utah more than the book, but you quote the section from Washington's Thanksgiving proclamation, or sorry, his farewell address, excuse me, where he says, with shades of difference, you're all sort of like, one people, one language, one religion. And I tend to agree with you that I take him to mean what you call pan-Protestantism, like you're of one religion because generically most of y'all are Protestant. And it's similar language to what's used in the Federalist Papers. I think it's Federalist 2 or 3, one of the J ones there at the beginning, where he says, basically we have this providential circumstance where we have navigable waterways on both sides of the extent of our colonies. And look, we all speak the same language and have the same religion and the same culture. And I, in my just kind of study of the American founding, I guess, I think both of them are just myth making in a way. I think they're kind of obscuring real difference. And so I just wanted to read a quick quote from a letter from John Adams to Hezekiah Niles. This is from 1818. So this is him looking long back on the period of the Revolution and the Constitution. He says, the colonies had grown up under constitutions of government so different. There was so great a variety of religions. They were composed of so many different nations. Their customs, manners, and habits had so little resemblance, and their intercourse had been so rare and their knowledge of each other so imperfect that to unite them in the same principles in theory and the same system of action was certainly a very difficult enterprise. The complete accomplishment of it in so short a time and by such simple means was perhaps a singular example in the history of mankind. 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before effected. And so it seems like from Adam's perspective, and I think this is a historical perspective that you could defend, Edmund Morgan in his Birth of the Republic talks about this, how the pre-imperial crisis period, there were internal civil wars within colonies and between colonies. People were suing each other left and right. It doesn't seem like these people were a people. But then there was something that happened that kind of drew them together, that made them realize, okay, this is the moment when we draw swords together. And then when we unite around something like propositional principles, right? So the people already existed. Yes, they sometimes spoke the same language, not all of them, lots of Germans running around, lots of Spanish speakers and French speakers running around and all this stuff. And so not all of them have the same religion. You've got Quakers, you've got all sorts of wacky people running around that people hate, have still getting killed in England. But then something happens that makes them draw together into something like a unified political community. And so it seems like the project, especially in this more recent speech and in this book, says, well, yeah, there's something in America that harkens back to that as like a people, but it seems like on this understanding of a nation as a pre-existent thing, I'm not sure it did pre-exist this moment. It seems to me that it was kind of created. It was coalesced around, and then the habit sort of grew out of that, which to me gives me more optimism towards the prospects of things like diversity, even cultural diversity within one current modern nation state, eventually leading to some sort of unity. So I was just curious, like your general thoughts on that. And then do you understand effectively that this, the American nation, pre-existed this founding moment and then they just acknowledged it? Or is it something that was kind of like made?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when we're talking about diversity of 13 colonies, we are talking about 13 different political units. And so that it actually doesn't, it's a more of a argument against, it's more of an argument against sort of a type of unity among different political units. So I would say that if they are 13 different people, different constitutions, different manners, then and they couldn't come together, well, they'd still be 13 different units with similarity within, with a variety and differences like everyone has. So I mean, in that sense, I would say that actually kind of supports my more general principle that similarity is ordinarily necessary for the flourishing of a civil community. But at the same time, I mean, this was obviously on the minds of a lot of people. This is why John Jay mentions it. This is why George Washington mentions it. And there was also just concerns for immigration across the board among the founders. Of course, there's like that infamous, was it 1790 Immigration Act or something that said only white Americans, Europeans, or something like that. So that there was a sense in which there had to be people who came here had to adopt or be assimilatable into something. But yeah, I think this also testifies what I've said before, that different peoples participating together in a political life can over time come to see themselves as one people. And in America, what's unique is that we an Americanness. Like I've lived in a lot of places, and you have people waving American flags in different places, and they're still very different. I mean, I went to West Point, where it pulls from the entire country, and we could all relate to each other as fellow cadets and off to, you know, military. And with very, like, two of my best friends, one guy was very proud of being from Georgia, and the guy very proud from being from White Plains, New York, and they were best friends together. And so I agree. I agree. It's a but I agree that there was that issue at the time, but there seems to have been the ability to form a union and then form one people over time with regional differences. And I think this actually testifies to the. I mean, we have the Federalist paper, the Federal Convention debates. We know they all read Montesquieu. We know that they probably all read Locke. We know they knew the Bible. Most of them were Protestant. Most of them had English ancestry with maybe some German, and they were just different areas. But they did actually come together. And I would say that the reason they could come together, even though it barely happened, barely happened. We know from the convention debates it barely happened. They could still reference the same history, the same authors, in common cause and form together. So I just think that the situation you're describing is very different than having people who are of a completely different religion from a completely different part of the world, who themselves have a strong sense of their own ethnic identity that they want to preserve over time. That just seems very different than that time. But I get I understand I just don't see why that's grounds for optimism that we could have Christians and Hindus and that somehow can all become a common project, like we see back then. To me, it seems like there was a process of ethnogenesis that culminated in the early 19th century. I'm not the first person to say that, and so yeah, but I get the critique. So I'll just leave it at that. I could keep rambling on as I always do, but yeah.
Jerry, do you have any last minute thoughts?
Yeah, I'll ask a question that is more particular to me. So you talk about the use of the metaphor exile, and you kind of don't seem to have a full sense of that, and that the church identifies with exile because they longing for heaven, which I think is partially true. But I think there's I think we misunderstand exile in some ways, and I think like Daniel or Joseph are kind of the models that we have for that. And I think we look at exile as us being hostile towards the government that we're living under, and I don't think that's true either. I mean, there may be tension, and there's certainly maybe persecution. I mean, every New Testament author pretty much says the identity of the church is that the church is identified with Christ's suffering and so forth. But I think you can have political power within that exile model, and you see that with Daniel. Daniel had political power and authority. Joseph did too. Anyways, for me, that's more the model that we are living in, even though we're living in a Christian age here, at least, in the United States of sorts. I think there's a lot of false cultural Christianity that muddles it. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now, but thoughts on exile?
No, I know yeah. How do I address this? I mean, it seems to me that politics is ordained of God for the good of people in a civil community, and to not engage in politics for the good is a way not to love your neighbor. Most of us are average, and the average person isn't going to know to send their kid to the private Christian school down the road. They're going to send their kid to public school. And if Christians are disengaged from exercising power to shape things according to the good, then you have the average people sending their kids to degenerate institutions. And that's the product of disengagement. So I mean, It's
I'm not
it's
saying disengagement though.
oh,
You know,
okay.
so
So
I like
okay.
Daniel's engaged in a certain way in politics. I mean, he's given authority by the king and so forth to do that. And obviously it would look different in United States, but they're trusting God to accomplish it, not the institution.
Jerry, you are cutting in and out pretty hard.
Okay. I think it. I think our yeah. They're
I don't know.
trust. Okay, they're trusting
I don't know if
God.
that makes any sense at all.
Yeah. So essentially, just I mean, like, just okay. So the engagement is really limited to the prayer and not political action. Like to me, the exile idea is the fact that we're in a world that is fallen, and this means that we live in a place of death and decay. There's sin, and we have to see that our true home is heavenly, the heavenly home, and it's not here. So I don't think you can bring the kingdom of God down to earth through political means. Meaning, like, I don't think I'm not a sort of post mill guy who thinks that like
Right.
creating good things here is the kingdom of God or whatever. I'm a two kingdom guy, but yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that if Christians don't have a conception of good and they don't bring that in their political life, then it's going to. I mean, sometimes I wonder if like the exile motif is rooted in a type of liberal neutrality that, like, if we just kind of maintain like the contestability of politics in this neutral sphere, then that's the best situation. And maybe that worked in the 70s and 80s and maybe the 90s, but that was itself a type of like that decayed itself. And it seems to me that we're now in a realm of like overt hostility that's actually bad for people. And so we should so it was wrong for us to develop these political theologies in eras of like a sort of neutrality where it could work, we could get by, we could be Christians and people wouldn't give us too much trouble. But nowadays that's not true, and maybe us, like as educated, or we go to a OPC or PCA or whatever church, and we're engaged, we understand what this and that is, and we know that when we see a bad commercial we turn it off so our kids don't see it or whatever. That's because we're, I don't know, whatever we are, but most people don't think like that. And like, I just think sometimes like we as like the Presbyterians kind of have this not sense of superiority, but like a sense of why can't, like, we're doing fine, we can handle this, but just most people can't, and most people
Whoa,
won't.
whoa, whoa.
You
I
know?
have some serious problems there. You said Presbyterians can have fun. I'm not sure that's in the Institutes. I'm just throwing that out there. Not sure
Yeah,
if
well,
Westminster adapted that or not, but
yeah, some
feel
committee
like that's
has
a
to approve the
yes,
fun
correct.
time.
Yeah, and there has to
It'll
be
take
3
3 years to approve
subcommittees
it, but
to outline what fun can actually be had.
yeah, yeah, I know that's true. Actually, yeah, well, that's I'm trying to change that. Let's put it that way. But yes, I just think, yeah, that we, well, anyway, that
Yeah.
it doesn't do our neighbor any kind of good service to not want to assert ourselves in ways that are good and restrain the evil.
I'm not
That can go too
disagreeing with
far.
that.
Like, I don't say let's round up the heretics and all that stuff, but
I'll
hopefully
agree.
that kind of
Yeah.
All right, so we'll just have a quick closing question, which I hope give us all a little bit. This has been good discussion. I hope everyone was enlightened. I'm glad Stephen got to articulate some of his points a little bit better. Where are your guys' hopes for the church in politics over the next 4 to 8 years? We've got an election coming up. We've got another election coming up after that. Every election is the most important election you'll ever vote in. Surprising that happens every 4 years. What is your just general hope for the church capital, the American capital C church in general, as we move forward through this political season and the next 8 years? We'll go Jerry, then Philip, then we'll let Stephen have the last word.
I just think my hope is that the church preaches the gospel, offers the sacraments, and continues as a witness in the world. I mean, that to me, that's at the heart of the church. No matter what happens around us, that's what we should be doing. And God is going to bless us, through that work. I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think just to end, just to sandwich with another compliment on the book as well, is I think one thing that the conversation around this book has been good for is helping Christians grapple with sort of what next questions. You've got the quote from the Joker in The Dark Knight where he's like, I'm like a dog chasing a car. I wouldn't know what to do with it if I caught it. I think a lot of Christians are in that situation where the kind of Christianity that they practice, preaching the gospel, receiving the sacraments is great. Not as much consideration about maybe some of those sort of practical issues, like what if it happens that tomorrow or election season the people in power are more friendly to me than they were in the last election season. What do we do about that? What do their pastors teach them? What sorts of things do we counsel them if we're friends with them? That sort of thing. And so I think those are important questions. So what I would want, I guess, is for Christians both to obviously not put their faith in politics, but to continue to the extent that you are a minister of the gospel, to minister faithfully to the members of your congregation who have political office or political callings, and to the extent that members of congregations are friends with or perhaps holding political office themselves, that they would receive that well as well. So yeah, just sort of an aspirational gospel teaching, and then prudential wisdom of how to apply it when it so happens that we have political power in the American context. Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with what you guys said. There's a lot I could say, but one of them is that Protestants can dump the type of anti-intellectualism that you see. It doesn't mean stupidity, doesn't mean dumb. I think that it saddens me, even though I've learned a lot from Roman Catholics, but that they have essentially dominated conservative intellectual scene. I think that's for several reasons, historical, theological, and others. And I'm hoping that Protestants can kind of be a significant, like restore themselves as an intellectual force, create this intellectual ethos that's attractive. So what happens is you have an 18-year-old, he's evangelical, he goes to Hillsdale or something, he sees all these guys talking with this great respect and they happen to be Roman Catholic, they're brought in, and then they see they compare that with their evangelical upbringing, and it's just embarrassing. And so they convert. And apart from the question of conversion, I want there to be a Protestant intellectualism that creates that kind of environment, which means rejecting biblicism, which rejecting certain political theologies, and taking serious the broad Christian and kind of classical political tradition, and also the several different categories from natural law and other things. So I think that's changing. So my hope, and among other things, is that would change, and then we would be a intellectual force that has to be dealt with among serious people.
Awesome. Well, Jerry, Philip, Stephen, thank you so much for being on Church Coffee and for a good discussion. Look forward to possibly inviting one or all of you back. And for anyone out there, I'll drop everyone's Twitter, social media, book links, all that in the description below. And hope you tune in next time. Bye, everybody. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.